Okay, so questions, comments, and you might identify yourself. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm from Tampa. I'm actually a volunteer in the in the Project Downtown projects in Tampa. So thanks for acknowledging that. My question was about the Dalton Accords when you mentioned the Bill Clinton's intrusion in the Bosnian War, and you use it as an example of him standing on the line of Muslims rather, and the other way around as we've seen in recent politics. The question was if that was driven more by just the socio-political enclaves of the time, or rather an actual precedence that could be used in future introductions or future discussions of Muslims.
Yeah, that's a good question. But the way I interpret it, I just thought that that was a very unique moment. President Clinton intervened, and that is could be quite an exception if we compare to other people, other presidents. So perhaps it was him rather than, that's my observation, rather than other circumstances.
Yes.
Yes, I'm Randy Foreman. I'm an observer. Thank you, Dr. Gunn. I wanted to ask you about the Saudi corruption crackdown, where 40 Saudi princes got arrested. Your thoughts beyond the topic, what you think what's happening there, and B, if you did your work 10 years down the line, what do you see in terms of his reforms today? How is that how would that show up in your research if you did this work?
Considering Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
That's a very good question. My husband and I, we lived in Saudi Arabia in the city of Dhahran for 5 years, and another 5 years in Muscat, Oman, in the Middle East. So we have also the first-hand experience of Saudi Arabia. Regarding the crackdown, well, I would say I'm a bit biased because Al-Walid, I'm associated with the Al-Walid Center. I'm working in Al-Walid Center. So I wasn't, my personal feeling was that it wasn't right. I mean, these people, the philanthropists, have been helping the educational sector, and now they are locked up. So I had really, I was very emotional at the time. I didn't like it. That's my personal observation. And
he's free now, isn't he?
is he free?
He's free.
Is he free?
Well,
Okay.
he is not necessarily free to leave the country.
Okay, but he's out of the.
He's out of the Ritzy Hotel.
So, and if I have done some research in the Saudi Arabian context, now what I have done is Muslim settlement in Australia, Britain, and American context. That's why I'm taking the entire different factors into account, or analyzing different socio-political, economic factors. And I'm from Bangladesh. For example, sometimes some say, why don't you do on women in Bangladesh? So I tell them that, look, I'm just one person. I cannot do all the research of the world, and my friends are doing their sociology. So my answer is the same. If I had started research on Saudi Arabia, I would have gone, dug deeper about different factors that's taking place, whether it's a conservative society, or whether how liberal it will be, or how good they are with the minorities, even though they are Muslims. So I would have the labor market factor, how they are treating the labor. So I would have taken those things into the issues on women. I would have taken those issues considered seriously. But then again, since it's my research skill is interviewing people, so I would have to do some field work to get all these things done.
Yes.
Citizen. My question revolves this as far as the feelings that come across between whether you're pro or anti as far as that. The question being, is there one factor that you sort of came across that most Muslims are upset with America about that sort of causes them to react in a certain way? And also, are there any factors similar in America culture that would also be prevalent, say, in Australian culture or other countries as well?
So, as far as what I understand from your question is that
Basically, what don't they like about Americans?
What they don't like about America? Well, this research was done in 2009 and 11, so it's quite some time ago, and they have been mostly all of them had concerns on the media. but then again, they were not like the media representation of Islam and Muslim. It is across the board. It is in Britain, in Australia, common factor. They would talk about the media, that some media they would also point out in American context, say the Fox News or the Fox Television. So these are the common factors. That's common. Commercial media, they would say in Australia. So these are the common factors. But whether it would trigger them or whether it could, and what I found, they were very bicultural. Like, in their life story, when I interviewed them one-to-one, asked them about their interest in sports, in what they do after school, and their special interest in extracurriculum activities, I found that it was very diverse. They mostly spoke about American football and Kobe Bryant. That's the common in basketball. So I had to find that his image and go dig further. So what's they are doing in basketball. So they are mostly were in sports in American context. And since I found that they had some emotions, but they were just normal young people, having their everyday life go as other Americans. But my current research is on an investigation into the radicalization of young American Muslims. So that is something I think I would find what has been the distressing factor or emotional factor that a very minority few are going overseas or engaging in violence or terrorism.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, hi, my name is Grace Van.
Can you speak up?
Speak out.
Yes,
so-
I will. Thanks for your presentation. I have a question. I have two related questions. Firstly, how do you go about getting these people to participate in your interview? And then the second question relates to one of the first slides, in which we see what the kind of commonalities are in answer. To what extent is that divided based on kind of demographic characteristics, age, gender, education, and also maybe importantly kind of the generation of immigration that's going on?
Would you add to that ethnic background of
Exactly.
the Muslims being?
Yeah, and perhaps if I can add a third one, when we speak about Islamophobia, when you ask these participants about Islamophobia, to what extent do they relate it to the background, whether it being Arab or Asian?
Right. That's a very good. All the questions are very good. To what extent they were, first of all, my cohorts or the participants were educated. They were school children. They were either college, so more or less they are second generation, and they were pretty informed students. Some were from the Islamic school, some charter school, some public school. So, but when it came to the topic of Islamophobia, regardless of their ethnicity, they would have the same voice. Sometimes they would give their particular views if they thought that they were Arab and some Arab person was taken by FBI. So they would have some of those, or some would say, if they were Bangladeshi background, he would say that my mother was wearing the hijab. So it depended on the religious factor or their personal observation. So it was regardless of their any ethnicity. And how did I find the cohorts? I had to do a lot of network, go to schools, and particularly I had so many interviews about 379, because once you can get access to a school, you can build trust with the principal. You tell them the value of the research. Sometimes I did show PowerPoint presentations on Muslims in Australia. So the tourism industry of Australia should really reward me, because I have been showing all good things, beaches and wildlife and all good stories about Australia. So that's how, if the young people are really keen to participate, they want to have their voice, 15, 16, but they need their parental consent. So that goes through stages. And so once I was in the school, and I was at Harvard, so that was an incentive. She's from Harvard, wow. So that was a positive side. But then,
Can you get me admitted?
yeah, that's correct. But there were challenges. Some schools, say for example in New York, they have so many requests of research like this. So they would say, no, we are not interested. Again, in Florida, they say, well, nobody comes and takes interviews from our group, so please come. And they were so generous with their interviews. They would also come to my hotel, and they have been very kind. So these are sort of, with trial and error, I kept progressing, with my work.
Yeah, I'd like to just take the privilege of being the moderator and follow up a little bit. One of the early conferences that the center had now almost 25 years ago was a conference of Muslim leaders to try and figure out if we were going to talk about Muslim-Christian understanding in the United States, what were the Muslim voices. And at a coffee break, we invited a whole bunch of people. And at a coffee break near the end, an imam of Pakistani origin came and said, "Thank you so much for this conference. This is the first time I've ever had a conversation with an African American who was a Muslim." Did you find in your answers differences because of the ethnic and cultural background of the people that you were talking to?
Yes, that's a very good question, Professor John Ball. Say for example, with the ethnic people, they had one sort of voice, like it's Islamophobia, say for example. With the African American, that didn't come up much. That would be sometimes, I'm not generalizing, it could be, we are treated differently in the Muslim mosque or so with the immigrants. So sometimes they had this sort of emotions. So in the Muslim community dynamics, so they could have some different, or their history, like it has been oppressed, still we are. So that's a different one rather than Islamophobia. So race would come up, then again difference in the Muslim community would come up. So that you're correct. They had a quite different voice in my work.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is Will Rao. I'm a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service. I actually study East Asia, but I'm considering pursuing a career in journalism, and so I have one question about what you do. So, in the first half of your presentation, you showed a lot of cartoon work or satire that depicted the media's inherent flaws in reporting on the Muslim American community or the Muslim immigrant community. And a lot of modern theorists on journalism or journalists themselves say that satire or comedy is a way of holding the media accountable and pointing out its inherent flaws. And so, do you agree with this? Do you think that satire is an effective way to gain the Muslim community a more accurate representation in the media, simply because it calls the media out for its flaws? And if not, what's the next step?
Yeah, it depends on what media you're talking about. The media images I was showing, it's from the Muslim Observer. So they have a sympathetic tone for their own religious community, and that's why I could have their cartoons aligned with my arguments. And with the non-Muslim, like Sydney Morning Herald, so they had another broader sort of message. So through satire, then again it's a message, and a positive message, like there should be gun reform, it's high time in America. That's the message the cartoonist is saying. But then again, there can be satire which I would say there should be satire which doesn't hurt any group. That should be educational rather than, burqa, niqab, and having fun, and so that doesn't help. Again, sometimes satire, sometimes the cartoonists are not well informed. They would have a person in turban who is a Sikh, and they would have it for a Muslim. So there needs to be cultural education in the media sector. So I don't know, you young people should take steps. Yeah.
Yes.
Steve Lipson, in your research, the students you interviewed, what were their views and practices of Islam itself? And specifically, one thing was like, you talked about how there was the generational divide, and the younger students tend to think that their parents were old-fashioned and not fully American. And to what extent did they see those as like cultural things, and so not what Islam is? Or to what extent did they treat Islam and that perhaps dismiss them from religion?
Yeah, that's another good question. They normally consider the parents' culture in ethnic terms. So they didn't say, well, my parents says pray 5 times a day. They would say, my parents says come back home before 5 p.m. So they are, I think the parents' concern is more Western culture, they will be influenced, and ethnic culture will go away. So that's what I found. And since my research was on the identity and belonging rather than who is a good Muslim or who is practicing fire, I didn't go for that. So that's the reason that didn't come up. But there were some people like who said about dawa when there should be. So she meant that the religion teaches good stuff, and so there should be more information about Islam. So that came from her. So regardless of her ethnic, so she has some Islamic connotations in her work. So it was more about ethnic culture, I guess, what came up in my work.
Yes.
My name is Syed Ami, and I'm a retired NIH researcher, regional profiles. One question I have, based on your research, have you given any thought to what actually fuels Islamophobia in this country or in the rest of the country? For example, there are a lot of Indians who look exactly like me, behave like me. They are a lot very much successful. There is no prejudice that I can perceive against Hindus, Vietnamese, Chinese, all very successful. So what is it about us that fuels Islamophobia, actually, which
Right. Yeah. I would say this lack of this ignorance, number one, of people who are fearful of visibly looking different people, or it's what's going on overseas. The media news of the fear they have. They are putting through their representation about Muslims are terrorists or political rhetoric. So I think the fear and ignorance is mainly could be one of the reasons for Islamophobia. But then again, there are political issues when they want to make money, the Islamophobic industry, by targeting a group and making the division. So, and there are some reports that say that there's some institutional Islamophobia industry. It is institutionalized, to create anti-Muslim fear. Pamela Geller and Richard Spencer. So there are Jihad Watch. So there aren't any specific website targeting a Chinese group or a Chinese Catholic group or Sikhs. It's
not on the same scale.
But also there are Muslims who are very successful here. Most of them are
Well,
successful.
comparatively.
Yes, so there has been concerted effort by some minority who would say Muslims are the other. So.
Okay, yes.
Robert Molinski from Oxford University. I had the pleasure to hear about Yemeni Americans a couple weeks back from a professor in DC, just to hear some more information on a related topic. I couldn't help but wonder if your interviewees or related research covered the birth or movement or debate, as it were, and specifically the claim that former President Obama was not American. And it seemed to me that debate is very much at the nexus of politics, Islamic, the notions of Islam, and also American identity. So I wonder if that's something that came up with the research.
Yes, of course. That's in my I have a chapter in my previous book, Young American Muslims: Dynamics of Identity. I have an entire chapter on Obama. So they considered him as a world leader positively, but then they have been critical of. So it wasn't in my research question. It just like semi-structured questions. It just came up in the interviews, and then I had their views on President Obama. So.
Yes.
Fraser, retired international healthcare consultant, lived in several Muslim countries. I'm just focusing a little bit, make a comment and question. The comment is that in Saudi Arabia you have Mohammed bin Salman, who's the leader of Saudi Arabia. And you have President Rouhani is in Persia, in Iran, a great deal of tension. I have no idea if a similar tension between Shias and Sunnis exists in the United States, Australia, or Bangladesh. I have no idea.
Yeah, I think there are, in my interviews again, in the current topic, there are some tensions, Shia Sunni. Again, in the first generation, I have interviewed some Yemeni Americans in Michigan, and I have written a paper where we met at a conference. And so there are tensions, but not harmful, just through dialogue and communication. In Australia as well, I can hear sometimes say, don't go to that shop, it's a Shia shop. I met a professor who is in Canada, and he says, he has written a few books on Shia Islam, and he's a Shia himself. He says, he told me informally in a conference when I met him, he said, look, their students are not coming. They say that's a Shia professor, don't attend. So it's unfortunate that in some sectors of the Muslim community, this fear mongering and tensions are going on.
Okay, I have a last question then. You talked, when you were talking about the young people, you talked about their sort of biculturalism, that they were caught between two. My question is, did you get a sense at all that, at least among some, rather than a biculturalism, there was an alternative Islamically flavored American culture that was being created? I ask this because there is somebody by the name of Suad Abdul Kabir who has done work on Muslim hip hop in Chicago and has published a book called Muslim Cool. And she argues that among young Muslims in especially large urban centers with pop music and pop culture and things like that, that it isn't that, yes, there is sort of the biculturalism of old-fashioned waspy America and their grandparents, but that there is also emerging a Muslim cool culture, a different culture that is an alternative to the radical culture that you're looking at now. Did you get a sense at all of an Americanist Islamic young youth culture?
Yeah, very, very few participants. They did speak about in my this book, the recent book. They spoke about nasheeds and Native Deen, the hip hop groups.
Sure, Native Deen just across the river here.
Yeah, in the Adams, in Virginia, I guess. So,
Right.
And so they did, but minority few who would say that music is haram. And Muslims shouldn't hear it, so the alternative voice was nasheeds. And again, generally speaking, some said, yeah, they listen to nasheed. But at the same time, as I was trying to see their bicultural aspect, then I would see, well, they are into Super Bowl, football, women as well. So that again comes to my definition of biculturalism. That's their American identity.
Sure. Well, thank you very much.